Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time to a place of rolling green hills, stone farmhouses, and well, a whole lot of mud. We are going to witness the very beginning of a man who would one day be called the savior of France, and later, its greatest traitor. It is a story about how a hero can live long enough to become the villain. And trust me, the journey is as bizarre as it is tragic. You might find that, if you were dropped into his world, your biggest concern would not be grand politics, but simply trying to keep your shoes clean. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I would love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and the time in the comments below. It is always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let us ease into tonight's journey together. The air here is thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It is the late 19th century, and you find yourself in a tiny village called Courtier-la-Tour, nestled in the Artois region of northern France. This is not the romantic Paris of postcards. This is the heartland. The houses are sturdy, made of stone and packed earth, built to withstand the wind and rain that sweeps across the flatlands. The streets, if you can call them that, are unpaved, turning to sticky mud with every shower. Life here moves at the pace of the seasons, dictated by the planting and the harvest. And in the middle of all this rustic simplicity, you see a boy. He is not a remarkable-looking child. Quiet, watchful, with eyes that seem to take everything in without giving much away. His name is Philippe Pétain. Right now, he is just the son of a local farmer, one of many children in a hardworking, devoutly Catholic family. There is absolutely nothing about him that screams future national hero or future national disgrace. He is just a boy from the countryside. His destiny feels as small and contained as this village. You follow him not into his parents' bustling home, but to a smaller, quieter house nearby, his grandparents' home. He spends a great deal of time here, and also with his great-uncle, a priest named Father Lefebvre. This is where the first, almost invisible, seeds of his future are sown. Father Lefebvre is a veteran of Napoleon's Grand Army. As you sit quietly in the corner of a dimly lit room, you can hear the old priest's voice, raspy with age, telling young Philippe stories. Not fairy tales, but tales of battle, of glory, of discipline. He speaks of the tricolor flag, of the honor of serving France, of the chaos of retreat and the thrill of victory. For a quiet farm boy whose world is defined by fields and livestock, these stories are a portal to another universe. This is the mainstream history, a humble beginning, influenced by a Napoleonic veteran who steered him towards the military. But here is a little detail that often gets lost. Young Philippe was not just quiet. Some who knew him described him as being unusually reserved, almost cold. He was not the boy leading others in games. He was the one standing back, observing, calculating. It was a trait that would define his entire military career. Caution, a deep-seated reluctance to risk his men, which would later be hailed as genius, but was initially seen by his superiors as a lack of nerve, a reason why his early career progression was so painstakingly slow. You watch him at the local village school, run by priests. He is a good student, diligent and methodical, but not brilliant. He absorbs the teachings of the church, order, tradition, hierarchy, and a deep skepticism of the messy, loud, secular world of the French Republic that existed far away in Paris. And this is where historians still have their late-night debates. How much of the man he would become was forged right here, in this pre-industrial, deeply conservative soil? Was the national revolution he later imposed on France a backward-looking ideology that championed work, family, fatherland, a genuine return to the values of his childhood? Or was it a political mask, a convenient myth he constructed to justify a grab for power? As you watch him walking home, his wooden shoes clacking on the cobblestones. You cannot know the answer. He does not know it himself. Right now, he is just a boy dreaming of a soldier's uniform, a dream that seems a million miles away. That dream of a soldier's uniform, sparked by an old veteran's tales, did come true. But it was not the blaze of glory young Philippe might have imagined. It was more like a slow, sputtering candle. You're now a few decades older, and you are part of the French military establishment. The air you breathe is a mix of discipline, tradition, and the faint, ever-present scent of polish, for leather, for brass, for boots. And somewhere in this rigid, hierarchical world, you keep running into captain, then major, and eventually, after a very long time, Colonel Philippe Pétain. And honestly, yes, unimpressive. That is the word that follows him around the garrisons and training grounds. You see him striding across the parade ground, tall and imposing, his uniform always impeccable, but there is a stiffness to him, an aloofness that keeps everyone at a distance. He does not inspire passionate loyalty or camaraderie. He commands a kind of grudging respect for his professionalism, but nobody is inviting him out for a late-night cognac. He is, for all intents and purposes, a military bureaucrat, a man who does things by the book, meticulously and without a flicker of inspiration. The dominant military philosophy of this era, the spirit that electrifies all the other ambitious young officers around you, is called the vital impulse. It is the almost mystical belief that the French soldier's fighting spirit, his courage and audacity, can overcome any material obstacle. The doctrine of the day is the offensive, the charge, the bayonet thrust. It is romantic, it is heroic, and as it will turn out, it is suicidal. But right now, it is the only way to get ahead. And Pétain, he wants nothing to do with it. You are out on a field exercise. Other commanders are shouting about glory, urging their men to practice charging imaginary enemy lines. But you are in Pétain's sector, and what are you doing? You are digging. You are learning how to create defensive positions, how to find the best cover, how to coordinate artillery fire with machine gun placements. While others are practicing the sprint, you are practicing the patient, lethal wait. He is obsessed with firepower. You hear him lecture a group of junior officers, his voice dry and academic. Gentlemen, the bayonet is a fine weapon, but it is useless against a machine gun. The key to modern warfare is not the spirit of the attack, but the superiority of your fire. This brings us to our little-known fact. During his time as an instructor at the École de Guerre, the French War College, Pétain became famous, or rather infamous, for a simple, three-word phrase he would drill into his students relentlessly. The FAU2. Firepower kills. It sounds ridiculously obvious to us now, but in an army drunk on the wine of Elan, it was considered borderline heresy. It was pessimistic, defensive, on the fringe. His students found his lectures incredibly dull but uncomfortably sensible. While other professors waxed poetic about Napoleon, Pétain would spend an hour discussing the optimal trajectory of an artillery shell. Consequently, his career stalls. You watch his younger, more charismatic officers, men who give fiery speeches about the glory of the charge, are promoted to general while he remains a colonel, year after year. By 1914, he is 58 years old and is just a few months away from a quiet, unremarkable retirement. And this is where the historical debate really heats up. Was Colonel Pétain a misunderstood military prophet, a lone voice of reason who foresaw the trench-filled, machine-gun-dominated slaughter of the coming war? Or was he just a pedant? Was his famous caution a product of strategic genius? Or was it simply the reflection of his own risk-averse, unimaginative personality? Historians in one camp paint him as a visionary, the only one who truly understood how technology had changed the battlefield. They argue that his firepower kills mantra was a life-saving piece of wisdom, The other camp, however, suggests that we are giving him too much credit with hindsight. They argue that his defensiveness was not a grand strategy. It was just his nature. He was a man who hated risk, disliked improvisation, and simply applied his own cautious personality to military tactics. He was not a prophet. He was just a plodding officer whose personal style happened to collide perfectly with the grim reality of the First World War. As you stand there, watching him inspect a cannon, checking every gear and measurement with excruciating slowness, you would probably put your money on the latter. He seems destined to be a forgotten footnote, a man whose career peaked at competent but dull. The great storm of a world war is gathering just over the horizon, and you, like everyone else, have no idea that this quiet, boring colonel is about to become the most important man in France. Before that great storm breaks, before the world drowns in mud and fire, you get a glimpse of a different side of Colonel Pétain. A side that has nothing to do with artillery tables or defensive formations. It is 1914, just on the cusp of the war. The air in the garrison towns is thick with a nervous energy, but daily life goes on. And for the 58-year-old colonel, who is still a bachelor, a significant part of that daily life involves women. You are in a provincial city, maybe Amiens or Saint-Thomas. You are sitting at a cafe, the kind with small, round marble-top tables and wicker chairs that creak. The afternoon sun is pleasant, and you see him, not in his stiff uniform, but in a well-cut civilian suit. He is tall and still has a commanding presence, but there is a certain charm that emerges when he is off duty. He is known as a séducteur, a seducer, a lifelong bachelor. He has a reputation as a ladies' man, a discreet but persistent pursuer of romance. This is not the cold, aloof officer you know from the parade ground. This is a man who knows how to listen, how to pay a compliment, how to hold a woman's gaze just a little longer than necessary. You watch as he meets a well-dressed woman, perhaps a widow or the wife of another officer. There is a quiet confidence to him, a stark contrast to his professional caution. In his military life, he avoids gambles. In his personal life, he seems to enjoy the chase, the delicate dance of courtship. He is a man of routine and order, yet his romantic life is a series of overlapping, often complicated, affairs. This brings us to our mainstream historical point. For decades, his most significant relationship was with a woman named Eugenie Verdun. You see them together occasionally. It is a relationship that has been going on for years, since the turn of the century. They met, fell in love, but for reasons that remain murky, he never quite committed. He was always on the move, from one garrison to another, and he seemed to prize his independence. Eugenie, for her part, eventually tired of waiting and married someone else. But the connection lingered, too long, drawn-out affair of the heart that defined a large part of his adult life. Now for the more peculiar, less-known tidbit. Pétain was what the French call a chasseur de dot, a dowry hunter. While he was certainly a romantic, he was also intensely practical. A good marriage for an officer of his time was not just about love. It was about securing a fortune, a comfortable life, and social standing. You hear the gossip from other officers' wives. Colonel Pétain, for all his charm, has a keen eye for a lady's financial prospects. He wrote letters to various women, and a recurring theme in his personal correspondence was a rather unromantic inquiry into their financial situations. He once broke off a promising relationship because the woman's dowry was not quite what he had hoped for. It is a slightly comical, slightly cringe-worthy image, the future hero of France, a man who would preach national sacrifice, carefully weighing love against a bank account. It adds a layer of mundane, almost farcical realism to his character. This leads to a fascinating historical debate among biographers. Was Pétain's bachelorhood a romantic tragedy or a calculated career move? One school of thought paints him as a sort of tragic romantic, forever pining for Eugenie. the one true love he let slip away. His other dalliances were just a way to pass the time, to fill the void she left. His reluctance to marry was a sign of his undying, if poorly expressed, devotion. The other count, however, argues that it was all about ambition and freedom. His wife and family would have been a professional and financial burden. It would have tied him down, added expenses, and complicated his single-minded focus on his admittedly slow-moving career. By remaining a bachelor, he was free to move, to focus, to save his money, and to wait for the perfect match, one that satisfied both his heart and his ledger. As you see him say goodbye to his companion for the afternoon, a polite kiss on the hand, a promise to call again, you realize you are seeing a man of deep contradictions, cautious in war, a gambler in love, a preacher of austere values, yet a pursuer of personal pleasure, aim and obsessed with fire superiority on the battlefield, but equally concerned with financial superiority in the marriage market. He is on the verge of retirement, his legacy likely to be nothing more than a few fond memories in the hearts of several women and a reputation as a dull but competent officer. The world is about to change forever, and this aging romantic has no idea that his meticulously planned retirement is about to be cancelled. The pleasant afternoon sun of that cafe seems like a distant dream now. The air is no longer filled with the scent of coffee and perfume. It is thick with the metallic tang of fear and the rumble of distant thunder. It is August 1914. The great, ticking clock of European alliances and military plans has struck midnight, and the continent has plunged into war. For France, it is a moment of existential terror. The German war machine is on the move, and the French army, high on its philosophy of il vital, is charging forward to meet it. You are swept up in the initial mobilization. The mood is a strange cocktail of patriotic fervor and grim determination. Church bells ring. Men in new uniforms are marching through the streets, and women are throwing flowers. The plan is simple. They say, attack. Push into the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. Glory will be ours by Christmas. Amid this chaos, you catch a glimpse of the newly promoted General Pétain. Yes, General. The impending retirement was cancelled, and the desperate need for experienced commanders meant he was finally given his star, just weeks before the shooting started. But as the French army charges forward, they do not find glory. They find a wall of German machine gun fire and artillery. The brightly colored uniforms of the French soldiers, the red trousers, the blue coats, make them perfect targets against the green fields. The doctrine of the heroic charge, the very soul of the army, is shredded in days. The casualties are catastrophic, on a scale no one had ever imagined. The French offensive collapses, and suddenly, the army is not advancing. It is reeling backward in a desperate, chaotic retreat. This is where you see Pétain in his element for the first time. While other generals are in shock, their romantic ideals shattered, Pétain is calm. It is as if the world has finally caught up to his pessimistic, firepower-obsessed lectures. He is commanding the 4th Brigade, then quickly a division, then a corps. His promotions are now coming at a bewildering speed. As the French army falls back, his units are the ones that do not break. Why? Because he has been training them for this all along. You find yourself attached to his command. The orders are not charged to glory. They are find cover. Dig in. Position the machine guns here. Zero the artillery on that crossroads. He is everywhere, his tall frame striding along the lines, speaking in that same dry, unemotional voice. He is not giving inspirational speeches. He is pointing out tactical advantages. A battery of 75 seconds here, he will say, will enfilade any troops coming down that road. He is a cold, calculating architect of defense in a sea of panicked retreat. He saves his men not with passion, but with mathematics. He understands that this war is not about spirit. It is an industrial process of killing, and the side with the more efficient machinery will win. This brings us to a little known, almost counterintuitive fact about the early war. While Pétain became famous for his defense, his first major successes were actually in counterattacks. But his style of attack was completely different from the pre-war ideal. He would never, ever send his infantry forward until the enemy's position had been subjected to a massive, overwhelming artillery bombardment. You witness one of these Pétain attacks. It begins with hours of shelling. The ground shakes, the air splits apart. It is terrifying. It seems like nothing could survive. Only then, when the wire is cut and the trenches are flattened, does he send the infantry forward, moving cautiously behind a creeping barrage of their own artillery. It was slow. It was methodical. It used up a colossal amount of shells, but it worked. And most importantly, it conserved the lives of his soldiers. And here lies a persistent historical debate. Did the Great War make Pétain, or did it simply reveal him? Was he a man transformed by crisis, rising to an occasion that no one, including himself, expected? Or was this who he was all along? A man whose peculiar set of skills and personality traits were useless in peacetime but perfectly suited for the uniquely horrible conditions of the Western Front. Some historians argue that the war was a catalyst that forged a new man, that the immense responsibility awakened a greatness that lay dormant. They point to his rapid, decisive actions and his newfound authority as evidence of a profound change. Others maintain that there was no transformation at all. The war did not change him. It just changed the criteria for success. The cautious, pedantic, risk-averse colonel was, by a quirk of fate, exactly the kind of general that the meat grinder of trench warfare required. His rise was not a metamorphosis. It was the world bending to his shape. As you huddle in a muddy trench, listening to the shells from his well-placed batteries screaming overhead, you do not care about the academic debate. All you know is that the chaos has a center, and it is him. This uncharismatic, 58-year-old commander, who just months ago was planning his retirement and pursuing wealthy widows, is suddenly the most effective general in the French army. His star is rising, not like a firework, but like a slow, powerful tide. And it is about to carry him to a place that will define him forever. A small, fortified city called Verdun. The name itself sends a chill down your spine. Verdun. By early 1916, it has become more than a city. It is a symbol. For the Germans, it is a strategic objective designed not just for capture, but as a mill to bleed the French army white. For the French, it is the last bastion, the line that cannot be broken. They shall not pass. ILS ni passeront enti pas. The German offensive begins with an artillery bombardment of an intensity the world has never seen. 9 hours of continuous shelling from over 1,000 guns, turning the frozen landscape of hills and forts into a churning, lunar nightmare. You are there, in the chaos. The French lines are collapsing. Forts are falling. The situation is desperate. The high command in Paris is panicking. And in this moment of supreme crisis, they do the only thing they can think of. They send for the one man who has proven he knows how to hold a line. They send for Pétain. He arrives on a cold February night, not with a flourish of trumpets, but in a staff car that gets stuck in the snow. He is suffering from pneumonia, running a high fever, but his mind is icily clear. You see him step into the chaotic headquarters, a place filled with shouting officers and ringing telephones. A quiet calm descends as he takes command. His first actions are not grand pronouncements. They are brutally practical. His eye is full on the maps, and he immediately understands the two keys to the battle. First, the forts. The French High Command had, in a moment of baffling short-sightedness, stripped many of Verdun's forts of their guns before the battle. Pétain immediately orders them to be rearmed and held at all costs. But his second, and most crucial, insight is about logistics. The main railway lines into Verdun have been cut by German artillery. There is only one road in undoubt, the narrow, provincial track leading from the town of Bar-le-Duc. This is the mainstream historical point, the creation of la voie sacrée, the sacred way. Pétain turns his genius for organization to this single, fragile artery. He understands that Verdun will be won or lost, not just by the soldiers in the trenches, but by the trucks on this road. You are assigned to the road crews. It is a 24/7 operation, endless, grinding convoy of thousands of trucks, carrying men, ammunition, food, and water in, tearing the wounded out. The road is a river of steel and flesh. It never stops. Men are assigned to stand every few yards with shovels and gravel, constantly filling in shell craters, keeping the surface passable. If a truck breaks down, it is shoved unceremoniously into the ditch to keep the flow moving. This logistical miracle, organized by Pétain, is what allows the French army to endure. He ensures that for every shell the Germans fire, the French can fire one back. Now for a fascinating, lesser-known detail of his command style at Verdun. While he was obsessed with artillery, he was equally obsessed with his soldiers' morale, but in a very practical way. He instituted a system of rotation known as the Noria, or water wheel. Unlike other sectors where units would be left in the line until they were annihilated, Pétain made sure that no division stayed in the hell of the front line trenches for more than a week or two at a time. They would be brought in, endure the horror, and then be rotated out to the rear for rest and refitting. This had a powerful psychological effect. It gave the men a sense of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. It told them that their lives were not being thrown away carelessly. This system, more than any rousing speech, is what kept the French army from breaking. This leads to a deep and often contentious historical debate about his title, the Lion of Verdun. Was he truly the savior of Verdun? The traditional narrative, the one you learn it in school, is that Pétain's defensive genius and his humane concern for his troops single-handedly won the battle. He was the rock against which the German tide broke. However, a significant revisionist argument has emerged over the years. This camp points out that Pétain was actually relieved of his command in the middle of the battle, in May 1916. Why? Because his superiors, particularly Generals Joffre and Nivola, found him too defensive, too pessimistic. They wanted to counterattack and retake lost ground, while Pétain was content to simply hold the line and bleed the Germans with his artillery. He was promoted to a higher, less direct command, and it was his more aggressive successors, Nivola and Mangue, who led the bloody counter-offensives that recaptured the key forts later in the year. So, who really won Verdun? Was it Pétain, who established the system that made victory possible? Or was it the generals who replaced him and actually took back the land, albeit at a horrific cost? The French public, and history for a long time, gave the credit to Pétain, the man who stopped the bleeding. As you stand on a ridge overlooking the battlefield, the ground is scarred, pockmarked wasteland devoid of any living thing. You see the price of his strategy. The air is a constant storm of shrapnel and high explosives. This is not a battle of courage. It is a battle of industrial attrition. And the man in charge is the ultimate manager of that industry. He is not a lion in the sense of a roaring, charging beast. He is a different kind of lion, patient, watchful, and utterly lethal from a distance. He is saving France, one artillery shell at a time. And in doing so, he is becoming the most revered man in the nation. The thunder of Verdun eventually fades, replaced by the grim, attritional rhythm of trench warfare. But by the spring of 1917, the French army is at its breaking point. You can feel it in the air, a sour mix of exhaustion, cynicism, and despair. 3 years of slaughter have eroded the patriotic fervor of 1914, leaving behind a deep, the unweary war weariness. The final straw is the Nivelle offensive. Robert Nivelle, the man who replaced Pétain at Verdun and who promised a war-winning, decisive breakthrough, launches his grand attack. He assures the government it will be over in 48 hours with minimal casualties. You are part of this offensive. It is a catastrophe. The German defenses are far stronger than anticipated. The secret plan had been leaked, and the French soldiers are sent walking into a perfectly prepared wall of machine gun and artillery fire. The offensive gains almost nothing and costs France over 180 0 casualties in a matter of days. The army snaps. This is not a single, organized mutiny. It is something more insidious and widespread. It starts with small acts of defiance. Soldiers in a regiment ordered to return to the front lines refuse to go. They do not desert. They do not try to overthrow their officers. They simply say no. They bleat like sheep to mock the idea of being led to the slaughter. The defiance spreads like a virus from unit to unit. At its peak, nearly half of the French infantry divisions on the Western Front are in a state of collective indiscipline. They will hold the trenches, they say, but they will not participate in any more pointless, suicidal attacks. The French army is effectively paralyzed. For the High Command, it is the ultimate nightmare. In this moment of supreme crisis, with the army on the verge of collapse, there is only one man everyone trusts. The government fires the disgraced Nivelle and appoints a new commander-in-chief, Philippe Pétain, the man who is always careful with his soldiers' lives. You expect a wave of repression, firing squads, mass executions. That is the traditional way armies deal with mutiny. And indeed, there are courts-martial. Several hundred soldiers are sentenced to death. But this is where you witness the true genius of Pétain's leadership, which is our mainstream historical point. He understands that this is not a problem that can be solved with bullets. It is a crisis of morale. His approach is twofold. First, he makes a highly publicized tour of the front lines. You see him, this tall, austere, grandfatherly figure, walking through the camps, talking to the soldiers, not lecturing them, but listening to their grievances. He tastes their soup. He inspects their bedding. He asks about their families. He makes it clear that he understands their suffering. Then comes the second, more concrete part of his plan. He implicitly promises an end to the large-scale, futile offensives. He declares his new doctrine, "I am waiting for the Americans and the tanks." It is a message of patience, a promise that their lives will not be squandered. But he goes further. He dramatically improves the soldiers' living conditions. The food gets better. More meat, more wine, more fresh vegetables. The leave policy, which had been chaotic and unfair, is reformed and made regular. He sets up better rest camps behind the lines, with canteens and entertainment. He is, in essence, healing the army's wounds not with discipline, but with compassion and common sense. Here is the little-known detail. While Pétain is remembered for his humane touch, he was also a master of information control. He imposed a complete media blackout on the mutinies. No letters mentioning the unrest were allowed past the censors. No newspaper reporters were allowed near the affected units. He knew that if the Germans found out the true extent of the French army's collapse, they would launch a massive offensive and win the war. He managed to keep the crisis a secret from his enemies, and even from much of the French public, buying himself the precious time he needed to repair the army's spirit. It was a remarkable feat of psychological management. This episode, of course, is central to the historical debate about Pétain's character. Was his handling of the 1917 mutinies a masterclass in compassionate, modern leadership? Or was it a cold, calculated strategy to restore a fighting force? The hero narrative portrays him as a deeply humane commander, a true father to his troops, who genuinely cared for their welfare and put their lives above all else. His actions were born of empathy, The more cynical view, however, argues that Pétain was simply a pragmatist. He knew a broken army could not fight. Better food and more leave were not acts of kindness. They were essential maintenance, like oiling a machine. He did what was necessary to make the army functional again. This is supported by the fact that while he commuted many death sentences, he did allow several dozen executions to proceed, just enough to restore a baseline of discipline. Was he a savior or a brilliant manager? Standing in the chow line, you receive a ladle of a richer, heartier stew than you have had in months. You hear the news that your leave has been approved. You see the fresh drafts of American soldiers beginning to arrive. The bleating of sheep has stopped. The mood is no longer rebellious, but one of sullen, weary acceptance. Pétain has done it. He has pulled the army back from the abyss. He did not do it with speeches about glory, but with beef stew, regular holidays, and a promise to stop wasting their lives. He is no longer just the hero of Verdun. He is the restorer of the army, the one man who seems to understand the common soldier. His reputation is now unassailable. The war finally grinds to its bloody conclusion. November 1918. The guns fall silent. A strange, deafening quiet settles over the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. The relief is so profound it feels like a physical weight being lifted from the world. And as France begins to celebrate its hard-won, devastating victory, one figure stands above all others. You are in Paris. The city is electric with joy and relief. People are flooding the streets, waving flags, singing, weeping, embracing strangers. It is a catharsis on a national scale. And then, the victory parade. It is a moment of supreme national pride. Down the Champs-Élysées they come, the triumphant generals of the Allied armies, on horseback. There is Foch, the Allied supreme commander. There is Haig of Great Britain, Pershing of the United States. But the loudest cheers, the ones that shake the very buildings, are for him, Philippe Pétain. He rides tall in the saddle, his face as impassive as ever, but there is an undeniable aura of greatness around him. Just a week after the armistice, he was elevated to the highest possible rank in the French military, Marshal of France. It is a distinction reserved for the nation's greatest soldiers, a title steeped in history and glory. For the French people lining the boulevards, he is more than a general. He is the embodiment of their victory and their survival. He is the man who held Verdun. He is the man who healed the army. He is the wise, steady father figure who saw them through the darkest of times. He is, without exaggeration, a living God. This is the peak, the absolute, unassailable summit of his life and career. This moment, this parade, this adoration, is the central historical image of Pétain the hero. His name is etched into the national consciousness alongside Joan of Arc and Napoleon. Streets, squares, and schools are named after him. Every textbook hails his genius. He has achieved a level of fame and reverence that no politician, no king, no other general could match. He is the symbol of French resilience. But here is a peculiar, behind-the-scenes detail that complicates this triumphant image. Even at this pinnacle of glory, his famous caution and pessimism were on full display. During the peace negotiations that would lead to the Treaty of Versailles, Marshal Pétain was a key military advisor. While the politicians were debating borders and reparations, Pétain was singularly focused on one thing: the physical security of France. He argued passionately, not for crushing Germany economically, but for securing a permanent, defensible military frontier. His preferred solution was to detach the entire Rhineland from Germany and turn it into an independent buffer state, controlled by France. He believed that the treaty, as it was being written, was too lenient and would allow Germany to recover and attack again within a generation. He was famously quoted as saying of the Treaty of Versailles, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. It was a chillingly accurate prophecy. But at the time, in the euphoric atmosphere of victory, his warnings were dismissed by the political leaders as overly pessimistic, the paranoid fears of an old soldier. This leads us directly into the great historical debate that looms over his entire life. Was his tragic downfall in the Second World War an aberration, a shocking betrayal by a great man in his dotage? Or were the seeds of that downfall already present here, at his moment of greatest triumph? The traditional view sees to distinct Peter ends, the glorious hero of 1918 and the Sena, misguided traitor of 1940. This perspective argues that the man at the victory parade was a true patriot, and that his later actions were the result of age, mental decline, and the immense pressure of a catastrophic defeat. He was a good man who made a terrible mistake at the end of his life. The revisionist view, however, argues for a single, consistent Pétain. They suggest that the very qualities that made him a hero in World War I were the ones that would lead to his disgrace in World War II. His caution would become defeatism. His distrust of politicians would become a desire for authoritarian rule. His belief in a hierarchical, traditional France, the France of his childhood, would make him receptive to a reactionary, anti-democratic national revolution. His pessimism about the Versailles Treaty was not just military realism. It was part of a deeper, anti-republican worldview that saw France as decadent and weak, in need of a firm, guiding hand. His, as you stand in that cheering crowd, confetti swirling in the air, you see only the hero, the savior, the marshal. He is the rock upon which the nation was saved. It is impossible to imagine that this man, this icon, could ever do anything to harm the country that so profoundly loves him. The idea is unthinkable, absurd. The story should end here, with the hero riding off into a grateful and glorious retirement. But the story does not end here. The next 20 years of peace will slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to tarnish the legend. The living God will slowly begin his descent back to earth. And then, far below it, the roar of the crowds fades, replaced by the hushed, rustling sounds of bureaucracy. You are now in the interwar period, the 20 years of Pétain's grim prophecy. It is the 1920s, the années folles or crazy years in Paris, a time of jazz, artistic experimentation, and social change. But in the corridors of power where you now find yourself, the mood is more sober. The marshal, now in his 60s and 70s, is not a man for just clubs or surly start. He is a pillar of the establishment. As the highest-ranking officer in the French military, he becomes the vice chairman of the Supreme War Council. This is the main historical point of this era in his life. He is the guiding hand behind France's defense policy. And what is that policy? It is Pétain's entire military philosophy carved in concrete and steel. He is the chief architect and champion of the Mage and the Line. You sit in on the high-level meetings. The marshal, his voice still dry and authoritative, lays out his vision. The last war, he argues, proved that the defensive, fortified with overwhelming firepower, is supreme. Therefore, the way to prevent another war is to build an impenetrable fortress along the German border. An ultra-modern wall of interconnected forts, with underground barracks, retractable gun turrets, and its own railway system. It will be a concrete shield for France. It reflects his core beliefs perfectly. It is cautious. It is defensive. It relies on technology and firepower rather than the elan of men. And it is designed to save French lives. He argues for it so persuasively that the government pours a colossal fortune into its construction. It becomes the central pillar of French military strategy, a symbol of security for a nation still traumatized by war. But as you observe him in these years, you notice a subtle shift. He is no longer just a soldier. He is becoming a political figure. He writes articles, gives speeches, and is courted by politicians of all stripes, particularly those on the conservative and far right. His public image is that of the wise, a political father of the nation, but behind the scenes, you see him developing a clear political ideology. This brings us to a less known, and rather telling, detail. In 1934, amidst a series of political and financial scandals that rocked the Third Republic, Pétain was asked to serve as Minister of War. He accepted. During his brief time in government, he was not just focused on military budgets. You overhear conversations where he expresses his profound disdain for the messy, inefficient, and, in his eyes, decadent nature of parliamentary democracy. He complains about the striking workers, the immoral modern culture, the weakness of the politicians. His ideal is a more authoritarian state, one based on order, discipline, and traditional values, the very values he felt were embodied by the army and the rural France of his youth. He resigns after less than a year, frustrated with the compromises of politics, but the taste of power lingers. And this is where the historical debate over his political evolution becomes critical. Was Pétain a reluctant Cincinnatus, a noble soldier who only stepped into the political arena out of a sense of duty when the nation called? This is the image his supporters cultivated. They argued that he had no personal ambition, that he was above the grubby fray of politics, and that he only accepted positions like Minister of War because he felt it was his patriotic obligation to serve France in any capacity. The opposing view, however, sees a man who was actively cultivating a political profile and being groomed by right-wing circles as a potential strongman. Historians in this camp argue that his entry into politics was no accident. They point to his association with conservative thinkers and anti-republican leagues. They see his public pronouncements not as the words of a wise elder statesman, but as carefully crafted political maneuvers designed to position himself as the alternative to a failing democratic system. Was he a savior in waiting, or a would-be dictator hiding behind a marshal-less uniform? The evidence can be read both ways. He never joined a political party, never overtly campaigned for power, but he never refused the spotlight either. He allowed himself to become the rallying point for all those who were discontented with the Republic. You see him at state funerals on national ceremonies, a solemn, revered figure in his marshal's uniform. He is the conscience of the nation, the last great man of a heroic generation. But you also see him in private, meeting with industrialists, conservative politicians, and intellectuals who dream of a different kind of France. A France without political parties, without unions, without debate. A France ruled from the top down. He is playing a double game, whether he admits it to himself or not. He is simultaneously a symbol of the Republic. He serves in the great hope of those who wish to destroy it. The concrete of the Maginot Line is being poured, and so are the foundations for a future political catastrophe. Just when you think the Marshal is settling into a comfortable role as an elder statesman and military theorist, the world reminds you that the age of imperial conflict is not over. The scene shifts dramatically. You leave the gray, political salons of Paris and find yourself under the harsh, blinding sun of North Africa. The air is dry and smells of dust, spice, and sand. It is 1925, and you are in Morocco. France is facing a serious colonial crisis. A charismatic Berber leader named Abd el-Krim has ignited a full-scale rebellion in the Rif Mountains. He has inflicted several humiliating defeats on the Spanish army in their part of Morocco and is now threatening the French protectorate. The French forces on the ground are struggling, unable to cope with the guerrilla tactics of the RIFEN warriors. The situation is getting out of control, and Paris is worried. The government needs a commander with unassailable prestige, someone who can guarantee a swift and decisive victory. They need a hero. They call Marshal Pétain. He is merely 70 years old, an age when most men are long retired. But he accepts the command. You watch him arrive in Morocco, the revered hero of Verdun stepping into a completely different kind of war. This is not the static, industrialized slaughter of the Western Front. This is a war of movement, of ambushes, of pacification, a dirty war, fought in rugged, unfamiliar terrain against a determined, elusive enemy. This campaign is our mainstream historical point for this chapter. Pétain takes command and, characteristically, his first move is to demand overwhelming force. He amasses an army of hundreds of thousands of French and Spanish troops, equipped with the latest technology, tanks, aircraft, and artillery. He is not interested in a fair fight. He is interested in a certain victory. You are part of this massive military machine. The strategy he implements is a brutal, methodical one. It is a classic counterinsurgency tactic. Separate the guerrillas from the civilian population that supports them. The French army pushes forward in a slow, relentless advance, while the Air Force bombs villages suspected of harboring rebels. It is a far cry from the humane warfare he was credited with in World War I. And this brings us to a dark and often forgotten detail of this campaign. To break the will of the RAFians, the French and Spanish forces resorted to tactics that were horrifying even by the standards of the day. The most notorious of these was the use of chemical weapons. Mustard gas, dropped from airplanes, was used not just on enemy combatants, but on villages, crowds, and livestock. The goal was to make the land uninhabitable and terrorize the population into submission. While Pétain may not have personally given every order to gas a village, he was the commander-in-chief of an army that systematically used chemical warfare. It is a shocking stain on the reputation of the man praised for saving the lives of his soldiers. The lives he was saving were French. The lives of the colonized Moroccans were clearly a different matter. This campaign raises a deeply troubling historical question. Did the RAF reveal a hidden, ruthless side of Pétain, or was it simply a logical extension of his military doctrine? The hero narrative tends to gloss over this chapter entirely, or to frame it as a necessary, if unpleasant, police action to restore order in the empire. His supporters would argue that he was simply using the tools available to him to end the war quickly and efficiently, thereby saving lives on both sides in the long run. He was a product of his time, a time when colonial wars were fought with a different set of rules. The more critical perspective, however, sees the RAF war as a crucial and damning piece of evidence. It shows that Pétain's famous humanity was highly selective. His concern for saving lives did not extend to people he considered inferior or rebellious. This view argues that the brutal tactics used in Morocco were not an aberration but a demonstration of his core belief in order and hierarchy, enforced by overwhelming and ruthless force. It was a preview of the authoritarian mindset he would later bring to the governance of France itself. When faced with disorder, whether from mutinous soldiers, rebellious tribesmen, or later, political opponents, his solution was always the same. First, assert absolute control. Then, apply overwhelming pressure until the opposition is crushed. You stand on a dusty airfield, watching the biplanes take off, their racks loaded with bombs you know are filled with poison. The hero of Verdun, the man who wept for his soldiers, is now commanding an operation that intentionally targets civilians. The victory is swift. ABDL Krim surrenders by 1926. Pétain returns to France with another triumph under his belt, his prestige somehow enhanced even further. He is now not just the savior of the motherland, but the pacifier of the empire. The contradictions in his character are growing deeper, the shadows longer. But in the eyes of most of France, the hero has simply done what was necessary, and the sun of his reputation shines as brightly as ever. After the dust and brutality of Morocco, the martialess life seems to settle back into a more peaceful, domestic rhythm. You leave the world of military campaigns behind and step into a scene of quiet, personal significance. The year is 1920, though the events feel timeless. You find yourself as a guest at a small, discreet wedding ceremony. The groom is Marshal of France Philippe Pétain, now in his mid-60s. The bride is Eugénie Hardon, his lifelong love, the woman he had met and fallen for 2 decades earlier. This wedding is the central, personal event of this period of his life. It is the culmination of a long, complicated, and often interrupted love story. Eugenie, you remember, had grown tired of waiting for the eternally hesitant colonel and had married another man. But her husband had passed away, leaving her a widow. Pétain, now at the absolute peak of his fame and power, finally decided to commit. For a man who had been a notorious bachelor and séducteur for his entire adult life, this was a momentous step. You watched the ceremony. It is not a grand state affair, but a private one. He is no longer the imposing commander, but a slightly awkward, aging groom. She is elegant and poised. It feels like the closing of a circle, the final, happy chapter in a tumultuous life. He had reached the pinnacle of his profession, and now he was securing his personal happiness. To the public, it was a romantic story, the great hero finally marrying his one true love. It softened his austere image, making him seem more human, more relatable. But, as with everything in Pétain's life, there is a more complicated, less-known story beneath the surface. Here is the peculiar detail. The path to this wedding was not smooth. When Pétain finally proposed to the widowed Eugenie, her family, particularly her grown children from her first marriage, were vehemently opposed to the union. They saw Pétain as an old, unfeeling man who had treated their mother poorly for years, keeping her waiting and engaging in numerous other affairs. They felt he was now marrying her only as a sort of trophy, a final acquisition to round out his glorious career. The opposition was so fierce that it nearly derailed the wedding. It took all of Eugenie's determination to push the marriage through, against the wishes of her own family. This was not a fairy tale romance celebrated by all, but a contentious union that caused a significant family rift. This situation fuels a long-standing debate among his biographers. What was the true nature of his relationship with Eugenie and his decision to finally marry her? Was it a genuine act of love, a better late than never realization that she was the only woman for him? This view portrays Pétain as a man who, despite his flaws and infidelities, held a deep and abiding affection for Eugenie. His proposal was a sincere attempt to make up for lost time and to give her the public status and security she deserved. The wedding was the romantic endpoint of a lifelong passion. The more cynical interpretation, however, sees the marriage through a colder, more strategic lens. This school of thought argues that by 1920, Pétain was no longer just a soldier. He was a national institution. And a national institution needed a respectable domestic life. A lifelong bachelor with a reputation as a fool and heir did not quite fit the image of the father of the nation. Marrying his long-suffering, devoted Eugenie was the perfect move. It provided him with a respectable, devoted wife, America Lee, to act as his hostess and manage his household. It tidied up the messy loose ends of his personal life and completed his transformation into a venerable elder statesman. According to this view, the marriage was less about passion and more about presentation. It was another calculated step in the careful construction of the Pétain myth. You watch the newly married couple. He is attentive. She seems content. They settle into a quiet life in a grand apartment in Paris. She becomes the fierce guardian of his public image and his private comfort. She manages his correspondence, entertains his important guests, and insulates him from the petty annoyances of daily life. She is, by all accounts, utterly devoted to him. Whatever his motivations for the marriage, he seems to have found a stable and supportive home life for the first time. For a man entering his 70s, it appears to be a peaceful retirement. He has his glory, his high-ranking position, and now a wife. The stage seems set for a quiet final act, filled with domestic tranquility and public reverence. But the quiet rooms of their apartment will soon be filled with the whispers of political intrigue, whispers that will once again draw the old marshal out of his comfortable home and into the heart of a national storm. The domestic tranquility of the Marshallese marriage is a calm surface on a churning political sea. You are now in the 1930s. The world is darkening. The Great Depression has hit France hard, creating economic chaos and social unrest. In Germany, Hitler has risen to power. The 20-year armistice is ticking towards its end, just as Pétain predicted. And in Paris, the Third Republic seems weak, unstable, and incapable of dealing with the mounting crises. You find yourself moving through the elegant drawing rooms and exclusive private clubs of the Parisian elite. The air is thick with expensive cigar smoke and quiet, urgent conversations. These are the places where the powerful meet: industrialists, bankers, high-ranking civil servants, conservative politicians, and military leaders. And a name you hear whispered over and over again, with a mixture of reverence and hope, is Pétain. The marshal is now a fixture in these circles. He and his wife host discreet dinners. He attends meetings of influential conservative groups. He is no longer just a military advisor. He has become a political symbol for a growing segment of French society that has lost faith in democracy. This is the mainstream historical development of this period, Pétain's gradual transformation into the great hope of the French right wing. They see him as the only man with the prestige and authority to save France from what they perceive as the triple threat of communism, parliamentary chaos, and moral decay. You listen to the whispers in the corridors after a meeting. The Republic is rotten, one industrialist mutters to another. We need a man of order. We need the marshal. They dream of a new France, an authoritarian state modeled on Salazar as Portugal or Franco as Spain. A France where strikes are outlawed, where traditional Catholic values are restored, and where a strong leader makes the decisions without all the messy debate of Parliament. Pétain becomes the figurehead for this movement, the honest soldier who can cleanse the nation. Now for a specific, chillingly prophetic, and less known detail. In 1935, a conservative politician named Gustave Herve published a book titled C'est Pétain qu'il nous faut. It is Pétain we need. The book was a sensation in right-wing circles. It openly called for Pétain to be granted emergency powers to rule France as a benevolent dictator. It laid out a blueprint for a national revolution that would dissolve Parliament and remake the country along authoritarian lines. What is most revealing is Pétain's reaction. He did not disavow the book. He did not condemn this call to overthrow the republic he was sworn to serve. Instead, you see him meeting privately with her. He writes a polite, non-committal but vaguely appreciative letter to the author. He allows the movement to build around his name, never explicitly endorsing it, but never shutting it down either. He cultivates an aura of being above politics while simultaneously being the central figure in a deeply political project. This behavior is at the heart of the historical debate about his ambition. Was Pétain a passive vessel for the ambitions of others? An old man who was manipulated by a clever and determined right-wing clique. This is the senile puppet theory. It argues that the aging marshal, perhaps flattered by the attention, was simply a figurehead. He did not fully grasp the implications of the movement that had adopted him. The real plotters were the politicians and ideologues around him, who planned to use his immense prestige as a battering ram against the Republic. The contrary argument, and one that has gained much traction, is the active conspirator theory. This view holds that Pétain was far from passive. He was a shrewd, patient, and ambitious political operator who knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that an open bid for power would fail and tarnish his image. Instead, he played a long game. He allowed others to do the dirty work of building the Pétain ISD movement, while he remained officially aloof, preserving his heroic status. He was waiting, as he had waited for the Americans and the tanks in 1917, for the perfect crisis. He was waiting for a moment of national disaster so profound that the French people themselves would turn to him and beg him to take power. According to this view, he was not being manipulated. He was biding his time. You see him leaving one of these private club meetings, nodding gravely to the men who bow slightly as he passes. His public statements are full of vague warnings about France's decline and the need for a moral renewal. To the general public, he is still the wise hero of Verdun, offering sage, if pessimistic, advice. They do not hear the whispers in the corridors. They do not know about the books being written in his name. They do not see the web of influence being woven around him. The hero is still standing on his pedestal, but the ground beneath it is being deliberately eroded by men who are waiting for it, and the entire republic, to come crashing down. And the marshal is quietly watching them work, his face an unreadable mask. The whispers in the corridors are about to be drowned out by the scream of dive bombers and the clatter of tank treads. It is May 1940. The phony war, the strange, quiet period of waiting, is over. Hitler has unleashed his blitzkrieg on the West. You are on the front lines, and the experience is one of bewildering, terrifying speed. The German army does the one thing the French High Command, including Pétain, had always deemed impossible. They do not smash their head against the Maginot Line. They go around it. They punch through the Ardennes forest, Artillery, wooded area that the French considered impassable for a large armored force. Panzers pour through the gap, followed by infantry. The strategy is audacious, and it works perfectly. You are part of a French unit that is suddenly, inexplicably, behind enemy lines. Communications are cut. Orders are contradictory or non-existent. Stuka dive bombers, the Jericho trumpets with their terrifying sirens, strafe the roads, creating chaos among columns of retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians. The French army, trained for the slow, methodical, static warfare of World War I, is completely unprepared for this new kind of mechanized speed. The soldiers are brave, but their leadership is paralyzed. The entire defensive strategy, built around the concrete fortress of the Maginot Line, has been rendered irrelevant in a matter of days. This is the mainstream history of the fall of France in 1940, a stunning military collapse caused by a combination of flawed French doctrine, poor leadership, and a brilliant, high-risk German plan. The French army, considered the most powerful in the world, simply disintegrates. The defeat is not just military. It is psychological. A profound sense of shock and disbelief grips the nation. How could this have happened? How could the victors of 1918 be so utterly rooted in 1940? Now let us zoom in on a strange and controversial detail from the heart of the collapse. As the French government and military leadership reel from the disaster, a bizarre atmosphere of defeatism takes hold at the highest levels, long before the military situation on the ground was truly hopeless. There were still millions of French soldiers, a powerful navy, and a vast colonial empire from which the fight could have continued. Yet you are a fly on the wall in the command headquarters, and you hear powerful figures, both military and political, talking openly about the need for an armistice. Not a tactical retreat, not a government in exile, but a surrender. The speed with which this idea takes root is, frankly, shocking. It is as if some in the leadership were not just defeated, but almost relieved to be defeated. This leads to one of the most contentious and painful historical debates in modern French history. Was the military defeat of 1940 inevitable? Or was the battle deliberately lost by a political and military elite that wanted to see the Republic fall? The traditional argument is that the military situation was indeed catastrophic and irreversible. The French army was outmaneuvered and broken. The leadership, facing the prospect of the total destruction of Paris and millions more casualties, made the responsible, if painful, decision to seek an armistice to save what could be saved. The defeat was a purely military one. The much darker, more conspiratorial view argues that the defeat was, if not engineered, then at least welcomed and accelerated by a fifth column of anti-republican, defeatist leaders. This theory suggests that figures within the government and the army saw the German invasion not as a disaster, but as a grim opportunity. It was the crisis they had been waiting for. The defeat would sweep away the decadent, Third Republican allow them to impose their desired authoritarian national revolution on a stunned and broken populace. Proponents of this view point to the strange lack of will to fight on from North Africa, the rush to declare defeat, and the readiness with which an alternative government was formed. They argue that France was not just defeated by the Germans, it was betrayed from within. Historians still fiercely debate the extent of this plot, but the stench of it hangs heavy over the events of May and June 1940. You are caught up in the great civilian exodus, the Exode. The roads are choked with millions of terrified people, fleeing south in cars, on bicycles, on foot, with their belongings piled high on carts. The German planes attack them mercilessly. It is a nation coming apart at the seams. The government is in disarray, fleeing from Paris to Tours, then to Bordeaux. The army has ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The foundations of the state have crumbled. The stage is now perfectly set. The nation is on its knees, broken and desperate. And in its darkest hour, all eyes will turn to one man. The old hero, the savior, the marshal, the man they believed could perform another miracle. The air in Bordeaux is thick with humidity, panic, and despair. The French government has washed up here, in this southwestern port city, a temporary capital for a defeated nation. The corridors of the prefecture are crammed with frantic politicians, harried civil servants, and grim-faced generals. The debate raging behind closed doors is frantic and existential. Should they fight on from the colonies, from North Africa, with the powerful navy still intact? Or should they accept the inevitable and ask for an armistice? Into this cauldron of chaos steps the marshal. He had been serving as the French ambassador to Spain, a post given to him by the government to keep the influential but troublesome old hero at a safe distance. But as the disaster unfolded, the Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, made a fateful decision. He recalled Pétain and appointed him Deputy Prime Minister, hoping the Marshal's immense prestige would steady the nation's nerve and bolster the will to fight. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. You are a junior aide in the government, and you witness his arrival. He is 84 years old. He moves slowly, his face a mask of solemn gravity. He is no longer just a man, he is a walking monument. And his presence does not bolster the will to fight. It does the exact opposite. He becomes the rallying point for the Armistice Party, the faction that believes the war is lost and that further resistance is a futile sacrifice. This is the key historical moment, Petain's role in the fall of the French government. The Prime Minister, Reynaud, and a few others, like a little-known junior general named Charles de Gaulle, argue passionately for continuing the war from the Empire. But Petain's argument is simple, powerful, and deeply resonant with the exhausted and defeated mood of the country. You hear him speak in a cabinet meeting, his voice thin but firm. He says his duty is to stay with the French people on the soil of France, to share in their suffering. He frames leaving for Africa as a cowardly act of desertion. He argues that the army is defeated and that an armistice is the only honorable solution to stop the killing and preserve the nation from total destruction. His immense prestige, the weight of Verdun and his marshal's baton, crushes all opposition. One by one, the ministers fall in line. Reynaud, finding himself isolated, resigns. The president, seeing no other option, asks Marshal Pétain to form a new government. Now for a small but incredibly telling detail. On the night of June 16th, just after being appointed Prime Minister, Pétain summons the Spanish ambassador. He does not ask for military aid or diplomatic support. He asks the ambassador to urgently transmit a message to Hitler, requesting the terms for an armistice. He does this before he has even officially announced his new government to the French people. His first act as leader is to sue for peace. It reveals a sense of premeditation, an eagerness to end the fight that goes beyond a simple acceptance of military reality. This action is at the core of the historical debate. Was Pétain a reluctant savior or an opportunistic usurper? The traditional, sympathetic view paints him as a tragic figure, a patriot forced to make an unbearable choice. In this narrative, he is the ultimate sacrificer. He takes upon himself the shame of the armistice to shield the French people from further harm. He is the father figure who stays behind to protect his children, even if it means dealing with the enemy. He believes he is saving France from the fate of Poland, total annihilation in German military rule. His famous line, "Je fais la France le don de ma personne," I make a gift of my person to France, is seen as a genuine expression of self-sacrifice. The far more critical interpretation sees this moment as the culmination of the long-game conspiracy. In this view, Pétain and his right-wing allies, like Pierre Laval, were not saving France but seizing it. The military defeat was the pretext they had been waiting for to overthrow the Republic. His arguments against fighting on from North Africa were not about sharing the people's suffering, but about ensuring the government remained on French soil where it could be captured and dismantled. His swift move for an armistice was not to save lives, but to decapitate the state before the will to resist could reform. The gift of his person was not a sacrifice, but a power grab of breathtaking audacity, cloaked in the language of patriotic duty. On June 17, Yao Celine, you huddle around a radio with a group of stunned civilians. The crackling voice of the new leader, the old marshal, comes over the airwaves. It is a voice known to generations, a voice of authority and calm. He does not shout. He speaks with a somber, grandfatherly tone, and he says the words that will change everything. Sieste le corps, ser que vous des aujourd'hui huecuel fatsi sur le combat. It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today it is necessary to stop the fighting. For millions, the words bring a sense of profound, heartbreaking relief. The chaos is over. Papa Pétain is in charge. He will take care of things. They have no idea what they have just handed over, or what kind of France he intends to build on the ruins of their defeat. The fighting has stopped, but the national humiliation is just beginning. The armistice terms are harsh. Germany will occupy the northern half of France, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coast. The French army will be drastically reduced, and France will have to pay the enormous costs of the German occupation. A small free zone will be allowed to exist in the south, governed by Pétain. The air is thick with a strange, surreal quiet. The war is over for France, but a new, darker chapter is beginning. You find yourself in a small railway clearing in the forest of Compiègne. The location is dripping with historical irony. Hitler has deliberately chosen this spot for the signing of the armistice. It is the exact same spot, and even the very same railway carriage, where Germany was forced to sign the armistice that ended World War I in 1918. It is an act of calculated, theatrical revenge. A few months later, in October 1940, another meeting takes place, one that will be seared into the French national memory. You are an observer at a train station in a small town called Montreuil-sur-le-Loire. A train arrives carrying Adolf Hitler. Another train arrives carrying Marshal Pétain. The two leaders meet. They walk together, they talk, and most infamously, they are photographed shaking hands. This handshake is the powerful, undeniable, mainstream symbol of the policy that would define Pétain's new regime. Collaboration. The image is published across France and the world. For many, it is the ultimate betrayal. The hero of Verdun, the man who stood up to the Germans in 1914, is now shaking the hand of the Nazi Führer. In a radio address shortly after, Pétain tries to explain. He tells the French people that he has, of his own free will, entered upon the path of collaboration. He presents it as a pragmatic deal. In exchange for cooperation, France will receive a more lenient treatment and a better position in Hitler's new European order. He is trying to make the best of a bad situation, to be the shield of France. Now for the little-known context of that famous handshake. From the German perspective, the meeting was a disappointment. Hitler had hoped to persuade Pétain to bring France back into the war, but on Germany's side, particularly to use the French fleet against Britain. Pétain, in his characteristic way, was cautious and non-committal. He agreed to the principle of collaboration but refused to make any concrete military promises. He was not trying to be a full-fledged ally of Germany. He was trying to play a weak hand, to negotiate and bargain for France's survival. He thought he could outmaneuver Hitler, that he could get concessions without giving away too much. It was the gamble of a man who still believed in his own ability to control the situation. This brings us to the central historical debate surrounding Pétain and his regime. Was collaboration a necessary evil or a willing partnership? Was it a shield or a sword? The shield theory, which Pétain and his defenders would later argue at his trial, is that collaboration was a painful but necessary strategy to protect the French people. By cooperating with the Germans on some issues, they could prevent the full-scale, brutal military occupation that happened in Poland or other parts of Europe. They could maintain a semblance of French sovereignty, protect the population from starvation, and prevent mass deportations. The handshake at Montoyer, in this view, was a distasteful but essential act of diplomacy aimed at saving French lives. The opposing argument is that collaboration was not a reluctant necessity but an ideological choice. This view, often called the sword theory, argues that Pétain and his inner circle, particularly figures like Pierre Laval, saw collaboration as an opportunity. They wanted Germany to win the war. They believed that a German victory would destroy the old world of democracies and communism and allow them to build their own authoritarian, reactionary national revolution in France under the protection of the Nazi Empire. The handshake was not just a pragmatic deal. It was a pact. It was an alignment of two regimes that, while different, shared a common hatred of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. They were not just passively cooperating. They were actively helping the German war effort and pursuing their own political project. As you look at the photograph of the handshake, the aging, solemn marshal and the triumphant, smiling Führer, it is impossible to know his true intentions. Is he a patriot playing a desperately weak hand, trying to buffer his people from the storm? Is he a senile old man being manipulated by a master politician? Or is he a true believer, a man who sees in Hitler's victory the chance to finally create the kind of hierarchical, authoritarian France he has always dreamed of? The handshake is ambiguous. It can be read as a sacrifice or a surrender, a clever tactic or a profound betrayal. But one thing is certain, with this single gesture, Pétain has bound the fate of his government, and of France, to that of Nazi Germany. The path he has chosen leads directly to a quiet spot town, which is about to become the capital of a broken nation. The handshake at Montoyer sets the stage, but the daily reality of Pétain's new France is established in a place you would never expect. Forget Paris. The new capital of the Free Zone is not some grand, historic city. It is Vichy. You arrive in this town nestled in the heart of central France, and your first impression is, it is a spa town, a resort. The air smells faintly of sulfur from the famous thermal springs. The streets are lined with grand but slightly faded Belle Époque hotels, parks with neatly manicured lawns, and a large, ornate casino. This is a place people came to cure their liver ailments and play baccarat, not to run a country in the midst of a world war. The choice of Vichy as the capital is our mainstream historical fact for this chapter. Why Vichy? The reasons are brutally practical. After the government fled to Bordeaux, they needed a new home in the unoccupied zone. Vichy happened to have more hotels than any other town in central France, which meant it had thousands of rooms to house the ministries and government officials. It also had a modern telephone exchange, a crucial piece of infrastructure. And so, by a strange quirk of fate, the destiny of France would be decided not in the Louvre or the Élysée Palace, but in the conference rooms of the Hotel du Parc and the bedrooms of the Hotel Majestic. You are now part of the bazaar, almost surreal world of the Vichy regime. The whole government is crammed into these repurposed luxury hotels. The Ministry of Finances in one, the Ministry of Justice in another. Pétain himself, the head of the French state, sets up his office and personal quarters in the Hotel du Parc. You walk through the hotel lobby, which now serves as a waiting room for ministers and foreign diplomats. Bellboys in old uniforms rush past secretaries carrying secret files. The atmosphere is a strange mix of grand tragedy and provincial farce. It feels temporary, makeshift, and deeply unserious, even as the decisions being made are deadly serious. Now for a peculiar detail of life in this hotel capital. The proximity of everyone created a unique political climate that became known as the Vichy bubble. Because all the ministers, their aides, and their rivals lived and worked within a few city blocks, often eating in the same hotel dining rooms, the city became a hotbed of gossip, intrigue, and conspiracy. You cannot have a quiet coffee without seeing the Minister of the Interior whispering with a rival of the Foreign Minister. Political careers were made and broken based on rumors that started in the hotel bar. Pétain, isolated in his suite at the Hotel du Parc, was often fed a carefully curated version of events by his chief of staff, who could literally control who got to walk down the hallway to see the marshal. This claustrophobic environment fostered paranoia and endless political maneuvering, often completely detached from the reality of what was happening in the rest of France or the world. This bizarre setup leads to a fundamental historical debate about the nature of the Vichy regime itself. Was it a real, sovereign government, or was it merely a puppet administration, the sham? The argument for it being a sovereign government, the one Pétain and his supporters clung to, was that it was the legitimate successor to the Third Republic. On July 10, the National Assembly had voted overwhelmingly to give Pétain full powers to write a new constitution. Therefore, his government was legal. They controlled their own administration, police force, and colonial empire. They passed their own laws. The handshake at Montreuil was a deal between two separate states. The counter-argument, of course, is that it was a puppet regime from the start. The vote to grant Pétain power was held under the duress of a catastrophic military defeat. Its authority in the free zone existed only at the pleasure of the Germans. And this became blindingly obvious in November 1940 when the Germans, in response to the Allied landings in North Africa, simply rolled their tanks across the demarcation line and occupied the whole of France. After that, any pretense of Vichy's independence vanished. Pétain became, in fact, a prisoner in his hotel. The puppet theory argues that Vichy was never truly sovereign. It was just a tool the Germans used to administer France more cheaply and efficiently than they could have on their own. It gave the occupation a veneer of French legitimacy. You walk through the quiet parks of Vichy at dusk. Elderly couples are taking the evening air, just as they would have before the war. The casino is still open. On the surface, it is an oasis of peace in a war-torn Europe. But you know that behind the elegant hotel facades, a new, ugly vision for France is being drafted. Laws are being written that will strip citizens of their rights, persecute minorities, and bind the country ever closer to Nazi Germany. This sleepy spa town, with its heating waters and stuffy hotels, has become the laboratory for a dark political experiment. The cure it offers is far worse than the disease. In the claustrophobic hotel corridors of Vichy, the Marshal and his new government begin their great project. It has a grand, lofty title, the Revolution Nationale, or National Revolution. This is not a revolution in the traditional sense, with barricades and guillotines. It is a revolution in reverse. It is an attempt to turn back the clock, to erase 150 years of French history and create a new, deeply conservative, and authoritarian state. You are living through this revolution, and it impacts every aspect of your daily life. The first thing you notice is the change in the national motto. The iconic liberté, the GA light, Freiheit, Liberty, equality, fraternity is scrubbed from public buildings. It is replaced by a new trinity: travail, famille, battery, work, family, fatherland. This is the core ideology of the National Revolution, the mainstream historical point of this chapter. What does it mean in practice? Work means the end of strikes and independent trade unions, replaced by state-controlled corporations. It glorifies manual labor and farming, harking back to a pre-industrial, peasant ideal. You see propaganda posters everywhere showing a sturdy farmer tilling his field under the benevolent gaze of the marshal. Family means a deeply traditional, patriarchal social order. The government passes laws that make divorce more difficult and restrict women's access to employment and education. The ideal woman is a mother, raising numerous children for the glory of the nation. Large families are given state awards. Fatherland means an intense, inward-looking nationalism. It rejects the decadent foreign influences of jazz music, Hollywood films, and modern art. It promotes regional folklore, traditional crafts, and a brand of patriotism rooted in the soil and the dead. But here is a peculiar and often overlooked aspect of this revolution: the creation of youth movements. The most famous of these was the Chantier Reste de la Jeunesse, or youth work camps. Conscription into the army was forbidden by the armistice, so instead, all young Frenchmen were required to spend 8 months in these camps, typically located in remote forests. The official purpose was to build character, teach forester skills, and provide healthy outdoor activity. You are sent to one of these camps. You spend your days chopping wood and clearing trails, and your evenings singing patriotic songs around a campfire. The unofficial purpose, however, is indoctrination. The camps are designed to instill the values of the National Revolution: discipline, obedience, respect for authority, and devotion to the person of Marshal Pétain. It is a slightly bizarre, French-flavored version of the Hitler Youth, with more emphasis on folk songs and less on military drills. This whole project raises a fundamental historical question. Was the National Revolution a genuinely French ideology, or was it simply fascism with a French accent? The case for it being a unique, native phenomenon rests on its deep roots in French conservative thought. Supporters of this view argue that it was not a copy of German Nazism or Italian fascism. Its intellectual origins lie in the anti-republican, Catholic, and counter-revolutionary traditions that had existed in France for over a century. It was a reaction against the French Revolution of 1789, not an imitation of the fascist revolutions of the 1922 and 32. Its emphasis on agrarianism and traditional Catholicism was distinctly French, contrasting with the more industrial and pagan elements of Nazism. The counter-argument is that these distinctions are superficial. While the packaging may have been French, the core product was undeniably fascist. Historians like Robert Paxton have argued convincingly that Vichy shared all the key characteristics of a fascist regime: a cult of the leader, a hatred of democracy and liberalism, a powerful and repressive police force, state control of the economy and society, and a rabid, exclusionary nationalism. The motto work, family, fatherland was just a more palatable version of the themes found in all fascist movements. The fact that it was less overtly brutal than the Nazi regime in its early years does not mean it was not part of the same political family. It was just a more cautious, more bureaucratic, more Vichy style of fascism. You walk through a village square. The bust of Marielle, the symbol of the Republic, has been taken down from the town hall. In its place hangs a portrait of the Marshal. School children are being taught to revere him as the father of the nation. The newspapers, all controlled by the state, praise the wisdom of his vision. It is a quiet, stifling revolution. It does not have the noisy rallies of Nuremberg, but it is changing the country from the ground up, remaking it in the image of an old man's nostalgic, authoritarian dream. The goal is to create a new type of French citizen: obedient, traditional, and eternally grateful to the savior who is leading them back to a supposedly golden, but entirely imaginary, past. As the National Revolution attempts to remake the soul of France, you notice something inescapable. He is everywhere. His face is on the new currency, on the postage stamps you used to send a letter, on the charity seals you were pressured to buy. His portrait hangs in every classroom, every post office, every town hall. His folksy, grandfatherly wisdom is quoted daily in the state-controlled press. They song, miracle, news for la, Marshall, here we are, is composed in his honor and becomes an unofficial national anthem, sung by school children every morning. You are witnessing the construction of a massive personality cult, one of the most pervasive and strangest in 20th century Europe. This is the central feature of life under Vichy. The regime does not ask for your loyalty to an ideology or a party. It asks for your personal devotion to one man. Philippe Pétain is no longer just the head of state. He is presented as the living incarnation of France itself. He is the father, the protector, the savior, the wise peasant who understands the true soul of the nation. The propaganda is relentless. You see newsreels of him visiting schools, patting children on the head. You see him touring farms, solemnly inspecting a prize-winning cow. The imagery is always the same. He is the calm, steady center in a chaotic world. He is the link to a more glorious past and the guarantor of a secure future. His age, 84 at the start of the regime, is not presented as a weakness but as a source of immense wisdom and experience. He is the grandfather of the nation, and the French people are his children who must trust his judgment without question. Now for a peculiar, almost pathetic, detail of this cult. The regime organized massive campaigns for citizens to write letters to the marshal. And they did. Millions of letters poured into the Hotel du Parc. People wrote to him asking for advice, requesting help in finding a job, or simply expressing their adoration. Pétain had a team of secretaries whose entire job was to read and sort this mountain of mail. He would reportedly read a selection of them every day, and it is said that this direct communion with his people genuinely moved him and reinforced his belief that he was acting according to their will. It created a feedback loop of adulation. The propaganda encouraged the letters, and the letters convinced the marshal that the propaganda was true. He became a prisoner of his own cult, convinced of his universal popularity, even as the resistance against him grew. This phenomenon sparks a crucial historical debate. Was this personality cult a spontaneous expression of public gratitude, or was it a cynical, top-down creation of the propaganda ministry? The argument for it being spontaneous suggests that in the wake of the 1940 trauma, the French people were genuinely desperate for a father figure. Pétain, the hero of Verdun, was the natural recipient of this national need. The outpouring of affection was real. People clung to him as a symbol of stability and hope in a time of despair. The song, the portraits, the letters, they were all a genuine, if misguided, expression of a nation as love for its savior. The cult, in this view, grew organically from the bottom up. The more widely accepted historical view is that the cult was a deliberate and sophisticated political strategy. The regime knew that the national revolution was a vague and unpopular concept for many, but the marshal was almost universally beloved. Therefore, the strategy was to fuse the regime with the man. You could not be loyal to Pétain without being loyal to his policies. The cult was a tool to legitimize the authoritarian government, to silence dissent. How could you criticize the nation's grandfather, and to unify the country around a single, non-controversial figure? The propaganda ministry, under men like Paul Marion, were masters at crafting this image, carefully airbrushing any inconvenient aspects of Pétain's past or present and selling a myth to a vulnerable population. It was a top-down, expertly managed campaign of mass indoctrination. You are given a small, metal pin to wear on your lapel. It is a France askew, a stylized double-headed axe that was Pétain's personal emblem and the symbol of the new state. Everyone is encouraged to wear one. It is a subtle but constant test of loyalty. Not wearing it could draw unwanted attention. The entire country is being asked to participate in this performance of devotion. The goal is to make the man in the state inseparable. To question the Vichy regime is to betray the marshal. And to betray the marshal is to betray France itself. This is the twisted logic that the cult of personality was designed to create. A logic that would have devastating consequences. The grandfatherly image, the talk of moral renewal, the patriotic songs, it all forms a carefully constructed facade. And behind that facade, the Vichy regime takes its darkest turn. You are about to witness the moment when the national revolution ceases to be a backward-looking social experiment and becomes an active participant in one of the greatest crimes in human history. Shortly after taking power, the Vichy government, on its own initiative, without any direct orders from the Germans, enacts the Statute des Juifs, the Statute on Jews. This is the tragic, mainstream historical fact of this chapter. These laws define who is a Jew based on their ancestry and systematically strip them of their rights. Jewish citizens are barred from public service, from the military, from teaching, from the media. Their property and businesses are Aryanized, meaning they are confiscated and given to non-Jews. This is not collaboration as a reluctant necessity. This is ideological alignment. The French state is actively persecuting its own citizens based on their religion. You see the signs go up outside shops, Jewish business. You see old neighbors, decorated veterans of the First World War, suddenly lose their pensions, their jobs, their place in society. And this is just the beginning. In the summer of 1942, you are in Paris, which is in the German-occupied zone. The Nazi authorities demand the deportation of Jews to the east, to work camps, they say. The French police, under the authority of the Vichy government, are ordered to carry out the arrests. This leads to the infamous HIV roundup. You watch in horror as French policemen, not German soldiers, go door to door in the Jewish quarters. They arrest thousands of families, men, women, and children. They are herded into the Velodrome de Hyper and or cycling stadium, where they are held for days in appalling conditions with little food or water before being put on cattle cars and shipped to concentration camps like Auschwitz. Now for the deeply shameful and little-known detail of this operation. The Germans had initially only demanded the arrest of foreign and stateless Jews, but the Vichy authorities, led by Prime Minister Pierre Laval, the chief of the French police, René Busquet, were so eager to demonstrate their efficiency and cooperative spirit that they went further. They offered to include French Jewish citizens in the roundups as well. And most chillingly, when the Germans said they did not need the children under 16, it was the Vichy government itself that insisted on deporting the children along with their parents, arguing that it was more humane not to separate families. It was a bureaucratic decision, made in a quiet office, that sent thousands of children to their deaths. This is the abyss, and it leads to the most painful and damning historical debate of the entire Pétain era. Was the marshal personally responsible for this? Did he know what was happening? The shield defense, put forward by his supporters, is that Pétain was a senile and isolated old man who was kept in the dark by his subordinates, particularly the fanatical pro-Nazi figures in his government like Laval. They argue that he was focused on his national revolution and had no idea about the true nature of the final solution. They claim he signed the anti-Jewish statutes without fully understanding their implications and that he would have been horrified if he knew the deportees were being sent to their deaths. He was, in this telling, a dupe, a prisoner in his own hotel, guilty of negligence but not of a crime against humanity. The overwhelming weight of historical evidence, however, points to the contrary. This view holds that Pétain was not only aware of the persecution, but was an active and willing participant. Historians have unearthed documents showing that he personally reviewed the Statut des Juifs and made it even harsher with his own handwritten notes. He was an old-school anti-Semite of the 19th century variety, who believed that Jews had a corrosive influence on French society and needed to be excluded. While he may not have known the specific mechanics of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, he knew he was handing over men, women, and children to a brutal regime. He approved the deportations. He created the legal framework that made the roundups possible. He was the head of a state that used its own police force to send its citizens to their death. He was not a shield. In this critical moment, the French state, led by the hero of Verdun, acted as the willing accomplice to mass murder. The patriotic songs sound hollow now. The grandfatherly image is a grotesque lie. The entire moral foundation of the Vichy regime, the pretense of protecting the French people, has crumbled into dust. The marshal who promised to share in his people less suffering was actively sacrificing one part of his people to curry favor with their conquerors and to pursue his own bigoted, exclusionary vision of France. This is the indelible stain, the point of no return from which his reputation and the honor of his government could never recover. As the war grinds on and the nature of the Vichy regime becomes clearer, a crucial question hangs in the air. A question that people inside and outside France are desperately trying to answer. Who is actually in charge here? Is it the old marshal and his hotel, or other, more sinister forces pulling the strings? You are still inside the Vichy bubble, but the atmosphere has changed. The initial, almost amateurish, enthusiasm of the national revolution has given way to a grim, bitter power struggle. The key figure in this struggle, besides Pétain himself, is Pierre Laval. Laval is a shrewd, cynical, and deeply unpopular politician who has served as Pétain's deputy and prime minister for much of the regime. He is the ultimate pragmatist, a man with no ideology other than the belief that France's only path to survival is to wholeheartedly embrace a German victory. He is the architect of full-throated collaboration. The mainstream history of this period is defined by the complex and often toxic relationship between Pétain and Laval. Pétain, the austere, conservative military man, personally despised the rumpled, deal-making, and famously corrupt Laval. At one point in late 1940, Pétain even had Laval arrested and fired, trying to steer collaboration in a more dignified, less subservient direction. However, the Germans were furious. They saw Laval as their man in Vichy, the one figure who could be counted on to deliver what they wanted. They put immense pressure on Pétain, who was forced to bring Laval back to power in 1942. From that point on, Laval's influence grew, and Pétain's seemed to wane. It appeared to many that the old marshal was now simply a figurehead, a poster on the wall, while Laval ran the country and did Germany's bidding. This brings us to a fascinating and revealing little-known fact, the theory of the double game. As the war started to turn against Germany, especially after the Allied landings in North Africa and the Battle of Stalingrad, a strange rumor began to circulate, a rumor that was actively encouraged by some within the Vichy regime. The theory was that Pétain and Laval were secretly playing a good cop, bad cop routine. Laval would make all the unpleasant concessions to the Germans, deporting Jews, instituting forced labor, while Pétain remained aloof, preserving his heroic image. Secretly, the rumor went, Pétain was in contact with the Allies, waiting for the right moment to switch sides. He was playing a long, clever game to save France. This myth of the double JEU was a powerful piece of propaganda, designed to keep the population loyal to the marshal, even as his government's actions became more and more indefensible. And this myth is central to the historical debate. Was Pétain a puppet master, a pawn, or something in between? The pawn theory, also known as the senile figurehead argument, posits that by 1942, the 86-year-old marshal was no longer in control. He was increasingly frail, isolated, and manipulated by the far more energetic and ruthless of all, He would sign whatever documents were put in front of him, his mind clouded by age. In this view, Laval was the true master of Vichy, and Pétain was just the respectable mask he wore to fool the French people. The crowns of the regime were Laval's, not Pétain's. The puppet master theory argues the opposite. It suggests that Pétain was fully aware and in command, and that his supposed rivalry with Laval was a calculated charade. He used Laval as a lightning rod, allowing him to take the public blame for the most odious aspects of collaboration, while he, Pétain, maintained his status as the pure, untouchable father of the nation. It was a cynical division of labor. This view holds that Pétain was the ultimate authority, the one who gave the final approval, and that he was therefore fully responsible for every action taken by his government, regardless of who proposed it. A third, more nuanced view, and perhaps the most accurate, is that the relationship was a hostile symbiosis. They needed each other. Laval needed Pétain's immense prestige to give his government a shred of legitimacy. Pétain needed Laval's political skills and his connections to the Germans to keep the state functioning. They despised each other. They fought for power, but they were bound together in a toxic partnership. Pétain was not a complete puppet, but he was also not a total master. He was a leader who had lost control of the collaborationist machine he had set in motion. A machine that now had a life of its own and was being driven at reckless speed by Laval, directly toward the German abyss. You see them in a rare public appearance together. Pétain, tall, rigid, and solemn. Laval, shorter, with his trademark white tie, looking like a shifty country lawyer. They barely look at each other. They are the two heads of a monster that is devouring France. One represents the respectable face of the regime, the other its grubby, functional reality. The question of who is truly leading whom is almost irrelevant. Together, they are steering the ship of state straight onto the rocks. And as the Allied armies prepare to land in Normandy, that ship is about to be broken apart for good. The sound of Allied landing craft hitting the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, is a death knell for the Vichy regime. The liberation of France has begun. For 4 years, Pétain and his government had existed in the strange bubble of their spot-on capital, but now the brutal reality of the war is coming home. As the Allied armies push through France, and the German war machine begins to collapse, the situation in Vichy becomes increasingly tense and absurd. The Germans, who had been the regime's powerful protectors, now become its jailers. They no longer trust their French collaborators. They surround Vichy with troops, effectively placing the entire government under house arrest. You are there in the Hotel du Parc during these final, chaotic weeks. The pretense of a sovereign government has evaporated completely. German officers now walk the halls with impunity. Decisions are no longer made by French ministers, but by the German ambassador and the local Gestapo chief. Pétain himself is a prisoner in all but name. He refuses to officially step down, clinging to the fiction that he is still the legitimate head of state, but his authority is gone. This leads us to the final, bizarre chapter of Vichy's existence. In August 1944, as Allied forces approach, Hitler gives a direct order. He does not want Pétain and the remnants of his government to fall into Allied hands, where they might be used for propaganda or claimed to have been secret resistors all along. So, the Germans carry out a strange kind of kidnapping. You watch as armed SS guards enter the Hotel du Parc. They go to the marshal suite and inform him that he and his government are being transferred for their own safety. Pétain protests, but it is a feeble, pathetic gesture. He is an 88-year-old man facing down a squad of SS soldiers. He has no choice. This is the mainstream historical event, the forced exile of the Vichy government. Pétain, Laval, and hundreds of other high-ranking Vichy officials and collaborationist militia members are forced into a convoy of cars and trucks and driven east, towards Germany. Their destination is a large, opulent castle perched on a hill overlooking the town of Sigmaringen in southwestern Germany. For the next 8 months, this castle becomes the seat of the French government commission for the defense of national interests, the farcical and final incarnation of the Vichy regime. Now for the truly weird, almost comical detail of this period. Life in Sigmaringen Castle was a surreal nightmare. Hundreds of French collaborators were crammed into this medieval fortress, a tiny, bitter France in exile. They continued to play the game of government. They had ministries. They published an official newspaper. They even had their own radio station. But it was all a pathetic charade. They were surrounded by their German masters, and their country was a castle. The infighting and paranoia that had characterized Vichy reached fever pitch. Rival collaborationist leaders plotted against each other in the castle's drafty corridors. It was, as one historian called it, a court of miracles in a madhouse. And this bizarre endgame raises a final, poignant historical question about Pétain's state of mind. Was he a defiant prisoner or a deluded leader to the very end? The defiant prisoner narrative is the one Pétain himself tried to promote. He claimed he was taken to Sigmaringen by force and that once there, he refused to participate in the charade of the government in exile. He went on a strike, refusing to perform any official duties, effectively signaling his break with the Germans and the collaborationist fanatics. He was, in this telling, a captive who maintained his dignity and his status as the true, if powerless, leader of France. The more critical view, supported by the testimony of others at Sigmaringen, is that he was a deeply deluded and tragic figure. While he may have officially refused to cooperate, he continued to believe he was the legitimate head of state. He expected to be treated with the full honors of his rank. He would take daily walks in the castle courtyard, and his small coterie of loyal followers would still address him as Monsieur le Miracle. He was a king in a fantasy kingdom, unable or unwilling to grasp the totality of his failure and disgrace. He was not a defiant prisoner so much as a man lost in the wreckage of his own myth, still clinging to the fiction of his authority while the real France, the France being liberated by Allied soldiers in the resistance, was celebrating his downfall. You stand in the cold, damp courtyard of Sigmaringen Castle, watching the old marshal on his daily constitutional. He walks slowly, his back straight, his face a mask of impenetrable gravity. He is thousands of miles from his home, a guest of the regime he collaborated with, a leader with no one left to lead. The war in Europe is ending. The concentration camps are being liberated. Paris is free. And here, in a German castle, the hero of Verdun is living out the last, pathetic days of his phantom regime, a ghost haunting the scene of his own catastrophic legacy. The war in Europe ends. The phantom government at Sigmaringen dissolves, while the rest of France is celebrating victory and beginning the painful process of recovery. The old marshal makes his final, fateful decision. He is in Switzerland, having been allowed to cross the border by the retreating Germans. He could stay there. He could live out his last days in quiet, comfortable exile. But he refuses. He still sees himself as the father of his country, and he believes he must answer to his people. He voluntarily crosses the border back into France, where he is immediately arrested. The scene shifts to a packed, sweltering courtroom in Paris in the summer of 1945. This is the trial of the century. You have a seat in the gallery, and the atmosphere is electric with a mixture of hatred, pity, and a desperate need for national catharsis. The entire, painful drama of the occupation and collaboration is about to be re-litigated in this room. And at the center of it all is the defendant, Philippe Pétain, Marshal of France, former head of state, now accused of treason. He sits in the dock, 89 years old, dressed in his marshal's uniform, but without any of his medals. He is frail but still upright, his face the same impassive mask it has always been. For most of the trial, he is silent. He has chosen a unique defense. He refuses to recognize the court as legitimacy. He claims that as the legal head of state, chosen by the National Assembly, only the French people as a whole can judge him. He sits through weeks of testimony, appearing deaf and detached from the proceedings. The prosecution's case is the main historical narrative of the trial. They paint a picture of a deliberate, long-term betrayal. The prosecutor, André Mornet, the man who had prosecuted the famous spy Mata Hari after World War I, lays out the damning evidence: the rush for the armistice in 1940, the handshake at Mont-Dwyer, the national revolution that dismantled the Republic, the collaboration with the Nazi war machine, the persecution of the Jews, the creation of a militia that fought against the resistance. Witness after witness, former ministers, generals, resistance fighters, comes to the stand. The most dramatic testimony comes from his political rivals, Paul Reynaud and Leon Blum, who accuse him of plotting against the Republic long before the war. The prosecution's goal is simple: to prove that Pétain was not a shield, but a traitor who willingly sacrificed French honor for his own authoritarian ambitions. Now for a little known, and deeply ironic, detail of the trial. Pétain's lawyers, in his defense, attempted to summon a star witness they believed could exonerate him, General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French and now the head of the provisional government. Their strategy was to argue that Pétain and de Gaulle were playing that double game, the shield and the sword. Pétain, the shield, stayed in France to protect the people, while de Gaulle, the sword, continued the fight from abroad. They argued it was a secret, patriotic pact. De Gaulle, however, refused to testify. He knew that such a theory, while it might save Pétain's life, would destroy the moral foundation of the resistance and the new France he was trying to build. He could not, and would not, legitimize Vichy in any way. This leads us to the final, great historical debate of Pétain's life, which played out right there in the courtroom. Was this trial a fair and just legal proceeding, or was it an act of political vengeance? The argument for it being a just trial is straightforward. Pétain was the head of a regime that committed terrible crimes. He was given a public trial, with lawyers, witnesses, and a jury. The evidence of his collaboration and his regime's actions was overwhelming. The verdict was based on the facts presented. It was justice, however painful. The counter-argument is that it was victorious justice, a show trial designed to create a simple narrative for a traumatized nation. This view argues that the court was highly political. The judges and prosecutors were all figures from the new Gaullist France, and the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The trial needed to create a clear villain to blame for the humiliation of 1940. By convicting Pétain, the nation could conveniently forget the widespread support he initially enjoyed and the complicity of many other French elites. The trial was not just about judging one man. It was about absolving a nation by sacrificing its fallen idol. Was he being tried for his crimes, or was he a scapegoat for the collective failures of France? At the end of the trial, Pétain finally breaks his silence. He reads a short, prepared statement. He does not beg for mercy. He restates his position. He did what he had to do to protect the French people. He claims his reign was a parenthesis in French history and that he was the rightful leader. His words change nothing. The jury deliberates, and the verdict is read out to a tense, silent courtroom. Guilty of treason and national indignity. The sentence is death. The old marshal hears the words, his face betraying no emotion. The hero who saved France at Verdun has now been condemned to be shot as a traitor. The death sentence hangs heavy in the air of the courtroom. The hero of Verdun, the Marshal of France, is to be executed by a firing squad. It is a shocking, almost unthinkable, end to a life so entwined with the history of the nation. For a moment, it seems that France is about to commit a form of patricide, executing the man who had, for so long, been seen as its father figure. But the story takes one last, crucial turn. The man who holds Pétain's fate in his hands is Charles de Gaulle. As the head of the provisional government of the French Republic, de Gaulle has the power to commute the sentence. The two men are a study in contrasts, their paths having diverged so dramatically in June 1940. Pétain, the established hero, chose the armistice. De Gaulle, the unknown brigadier general, chose exile and resistance. For 5 years, they had represented the irreconcilable ideas of France. Now the fate of the old marshal lay with the new one. This is the mainstream historical event, the presidential pardon. De Gaulle, despite being Pétain's fiercest political enemy, immediately commutes the death sentence to life imprisonment. His reasoning is both pragmatic and symbolic. He writes in his memoirs that to execute Marshal Pétain would be to deepen the divisions within France, not to heal them. Furthermore, he acknowledges the marshalless advanced stage, now 89, and, most importantly, his service at Verdun. De Gaulle makes a famous distinction. The glory of Pétain at Verdun was a national treasure that could not be erased, even by the shame of Pétain at Vichy. To shoot the hero of Verdun seemed, even to his greatest opponent, a step too far. So, the sentence is changed. He will not face a firing squad. Instead, he will spend the rest of his days as a prisoner. Now for a little known, and rather poignant, detail concerning this decision. While de Gaulle's public reasoning was about national unity and respect for Pétain's age and past glory, there was likely a more personal element. De Gaulle had been a young officer under Pétain and decades earlier. Pétain had been his mentor. He had written a preface for one of de Gaulle's early books on military strategy. There was a time when de Gaulle looked up to the marshal with immense admiration. While that admiration had curdled into contempt, a lingering, complex residue of their past relationship may have influenced his decision. Commuting the sentence was not just a political calculation. It may also have been a final, painful act in a long and broken personal history between the two men who had both claimed to be the true spirit of France. This act of clemency is, of course, a subject of historical debate. Was de Gaulle's pardon an act of profound statesmanship, or was it a calculated political move? The argument for statesmanship is the one de Gaulle himself promoted. It paints him as a leader rising above the passions of the moment. He understood that executing an 89-year-old man, a national hero however fallen, would tarnish the new Republican creator martyr for the far right for generations to come. It was a wise and magnanimous gesture, designed to begin the healing of a deeply fractured country. It was the act of a true leader looking to the future, not settling scores from the past. The more cynical interpretation sees it as a shrewd political calculation. De Gaulle knew that a significant portion of the French population, particularly on the conservative right, still held a degree of sympathy for Pétain. Executing him would alienate this group and make the task of national reconstruction much harder. By sparing Pétain's life, de Gaulle appeared merciful and strengthened his own position as a leader who could unite all of France, not just the resistance. Furthermore, a dead Pétain would be a fixed symbol, a martyr. A living Pétain, languishing in prison, was a much less potent political force, a reminder of the shame of Vichy rather than a symbol of defiance. The pardon was not about mercy. It was about politically neutralizing the Pétain legacy. Whatever the motivation, the decision is made. The death sentence is lifted. The final act of Pétain's public life is over. He is stripped of his military ranks and honors, with one single, symbolic exception. He is not stripped of his title of Marshal of France. The court did not feel it had the authority to take away a distinction conferred on the battlefield for the victory of 1918. So he remained, in a bizarre legal paradox, a convicted traitor and the Marshal of France. The man who embodied the nation's greatest triumph and its most profound disgrace will now be sent away to a place where he can no longer influence the world, a remote, windswept island, to live out his sentence in total isolation. The final journey is not to a grave, but to a prison on an island. You travel with the small convoy that takes the condemned man from the mainland to his final destination. The place is called Ildeyu, a small, rocky island in the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Brittany. It is a place of fishermen, rugged cliffs, and relentless wind. It is a place of isolation, chosen specifically to cut him off from the world and from any supporters who might try to stage a rescue. His new home is the Fort de Pierre Levy, a grim, gray stone fortress built in the 19th century. It is cold, damp, and forbidding. This is where he will live out the remainder of his days. You watch as the 89-year-old man, once the master of France, is led into his cell. It is a sparse, whitewashed room. There is a bed, a table, a chair, and a single, barred window looking out over the bleak prison yard. This is the main historical reality of his final years, a life of strict, monotonous confinement. His routine is simple and unchanging. He wakes, he eats the simple prison food. He is allowed a short walk in a designated courtyard under the watchful eyes of guards. His wife, Eugenie, is allowed to visit him and eventually to live in another part of the fortress, but his contact with the outside world is almost completely severed. He is allowed no newspapers, no radio. He is meant to disappear from the national consciousness, a living ghost locked away in a stone box. The vibrant, chaotic world of politics, the world he dominated for so long, is now a universe away. All the grand ambitions, the national revolution, the cult of personality, have shrunk to the dimensions of this single, cold room. Now for a small, sad, and very human detail of his imprisonment. In the early years of his confinement, Pétain spent much of his time engaged in a futile legal battle. He would write long, meticulous notes for his lawyer, trying to prepare an appeal, to have his case retried. He was obsessed with his legacy, with clearing his name. You can picture him, this old man, hunched over his small table, painstakingly trying to refight the battles of his trial, to justify his actions during the war. He believed, or forced himself to believe, that history would eventually vindicate him, that the French people would one day realize the sacrifice he had made for them. It was the last flicker of the will that had taken him from a farm boy to a marshal, now channeled into a hopeless quest for exoneration. This final, quiet chapter of his life encapsulates the last great debate about his character. Was he a monster or a tragic, misguided figure? The argument that he was a monster points to the undeniable consequences of his actions. He was the head of a regime that willingly collaborated with the Nazis, that passed anti-Semitic laws on its own initiative, and that used its own police to round up thousands of men, women, and children and send them to their deaths. The suffering he caused was immense. In this view, life imprisonment on a cold rock was a fate far kinder than he deserved. His obsession with his own legacy while in prison is seen as the ultimate proof of his narcissism. A man incapable of remorse, concerned only with his own place in history, not with the victims of his policies. The alternative view, while not excusing his actions, paints him as a more tragic figure in the classical sense, a great man brought down by his own fatal flaws. This perspective looks at the man on ILEDYU and sees a figure of immense pathos, a man who genuinely believed he was saving his country but who, through arrogance, prejudice, and a profound misreading of history, ended up betraying it. His flaw was a deep-seated authoritarianism and a belief in his own infallibility. He was not a bloodthirsty monster in the mold of Hitler, but an arrogant, stubborn old man who, when given absolute power in a desperate situation, made catastrophic choices. His lonely end, writing legal notes that no one would read, is seen not as the just punishment of a monster, but as the sad, pathetic end of a man who outlived his own greatness and became a prisoner of his own mistakes. You watch him on his daily walk in the courtyard. The gods are young men who were children when he was the hero of Verdun. To them, he is not a living legend. He is just prisoner 117. He shuffles along the gravel path, a stooped figure against the grey stone walls. The wind from the Atlantic carries the scent of sultan, the cries of gulls. It is a sound of immense, unending loneliness. The world has moved on. France is rebuilding. The name Pétain is now a synonym for betrayal. But here, on this island, the man himself lives on, trapped in the fortress of his past, waiting for an absolution that will never come. The years on ILEDYU pass with a brutal, monotonous rhythm. The seasons change, but inside the grey fortress, everything remains the same. The world outside is entering the 1952s, a new era of Cold War politics, economic reconstruction, and cultural shifts. But for the prisoner, time is almost up. You are a guard in the fortress, and you are witnessing the slow, final decline of a once great figure. The most significant change is not in his physical health, which remains surprisingly robust for a man in his 90s, but in his mind. His memory, once a sharp tool of command, begins to fray. The past, which he was so obsessed with justifying, starts to become a jumble of disconnected images. This is the mainstream historical narrative of his last years, a slow descent into senility. He begins to have moments of confusion. Sometimes he seems lucid, still referring to himself as the Marshal of France, still convinced of his own righteousness. At other times, he becomes disoriented. You might find him staring blankly at a wall for hours. His conversations with his wife, Eugenie, become more fragmented. He starts to confuse the past with the present. He might speak of Verdun as if the battle were yesterday, asking for reports from generals who have been dead for decades. This sharp, calculating mind that organized the defense of Verdun and the bureaucracy of Vichy is slowly clouding over, like a window being fogged by breath. This leads to a quiet, almost heartbreaking sad, little-known detail. One of his last obsessions was his uniform. He would insist on wearing his old khaki uniform, the one from his World War I service, for his daily walks. It was tattered and worn, a relic from a time when his glory wasn't ambition. For him, it was a shield against his current reality. By wearing the uniform of the hero, he could perhaps, in his own mind, erase the man who was convicted of treason. You see him shuffling around the courtyard, a very old man in an old soldier's uniform, a living ghost of a forgotten war, lost in the labyrinth of his own fading memories. This final mental decline is, in a way, the final act in the historical debate about his responsibility. Did his senility absolve him in any way? Or was it an irrelevant medical footnote to a life defined by its political choices? One perspective, a deeply compassionate one, sees his final state as a kind of ultimate tragedy. It argues that this cognitive decline was a form of natural punishment, more profound than any legal sentence. The man who was so concerned with his legacy forgot what that legacy was. This view does not forgive his crimes, but it frames his end in deeply human terms, a powerful mind reduced to rubble, a reminder of the fragility of all human greatness. It allows for a sense of pity to coexist with condemnation. The harsher, more clinical perspective argues that his senility changes nothing. The historical judgment of Pétain must be based on the actions he took when he was of sound mind and in full command of his faculties. His choices in 1940, his leadership of the Vichy regime, his role in the persecution, these are the things that matter. His later mental state is a private, medical tragedy, but it has no bearing on his public, historical guilt. To focus on his sad decline is to risk sentimentalizing a man who presided over a brutal regime. It is a distraction from the cold, hard facts of his political career. Justice, in this view, is about accountability for actions, not about the state of one's mind in old age. By 1951, he is 95 years old and is often bedridden, drifting in and out of consciousness. He rarely speaks. The government in Paris, recognizing that the end is near, permits him to be moved from the cold fortress to a private house on the island so he can eye in slightly more comfortable surroundings. You see him being carried out of the prison for the last time. He is no longer the imposing marshal, the stern head of state, or even the defiant prisoner. He is just a frail, dying old man. The great, tumultuous, contradictory river of his life, a river that flowed from a humble farm, through the mud of Verdun, to the pinnacle of power, and into the abyss of collaboration, is now slowing to its final, quiet trickle, about to disappear into the vast ocean of the past. He dies on July 23, Yao Zhou Wiao, at the age of 95. He attended a rented house on a remote island. The news of his death causes a final, muted ripple across France. The man who was once a god, then a monster, is now, finally, just a memory. His last wish was to be buried at Almont, the ossuary at Verdun, among the soldiers he had commanded, the men whose lives he had saved. It was a request to be remembered as the hero, not the traitor. The government, under President Vincentorio, flatly refuses. He is a convicted traitor, and he will be buried where he died, on the ILDDYDU. You attend the small, simple funeral. He is buried in the Island Des Cemetery, a small plot of land overlooking the sea. A simple white cross marks his grave. It seems, for a moment, that the story is finally over. The man is dead, the controversies buried with him. But the ghost of Marshal Pétain is not so easily laid to rest. This brings us to our last and most bizarre chapter, the absurd, almost unbelievable story of his stolen corpse. You jump forward in time to the dead of night in February 1973. The ILEDYEU cemetery is dark and silent. A small group of men are furtively digging up a grave. They are not ghouls or grave robbers in the traditional sense. They are a commando team of right-wing extremists, led by a man named Hubert Massel. Their mission, which they see as a deeply patriotic act, is to fulfill the Marshal's last wish. They are stealing his body to rebury it at Verdun. This is the mainstream historical fact of this utterly strange episode. The group manages to exhume the coffin, load it into a van, and smuggle it off the island and back to the mainland. The theft causes a national sensation. It is a shocking, surreal event that rips the scab off the still unhealed wound of the Vichy years. For a few days, the entire country is consumed by the hunt for the Marshal's missing coffin. It turns into a kind of macabre treasure hunt, with the police chasing clues and the government in Paris in an uproar. Now for the almost comically inept detail of the plot. The plan begins to fall apart almost immediately. The conspirators are amateurs. They hide the coffin in a garage in a suburb of Paris. The landlady of the garage owner becomes suspicious of the strange comings and goings and the odd smell, and she calls the police. Just a few days after the theft, the police raid the garage and find the coffin. The great patriotic mission ends in a suburban lockup. The government, relieved but embarrassed, has the coffin flown back to the ILEDYEU under heavy garden dray, interred in the same grave. This final, farcical episode is a perfect metaphor for the historical debate that continues to rage around Pétain to this day. Was his legacy one of honor or of shame? The men who stole his body were part of a small but persistent group that still viewed him as the shield of France, the moderate hero who sacrificed his own reputation to save his people. For them, burying him at Verdun was not just about fulfilling a last wish. It was about rewriting the official narrative, about reclaiming him as a national hero and placing him back in the pantheon of French glory. It was an attempt to force the nation to remember the victor of 1918 and forget the collaborator of 1940. The overwhelming majority view, held by the French state and most historians, is that his legacy is one of indelible disgrace. The refusal to allow his burial at Verdun is a firm and final judgment. It is a statement that his actions as the head of the Vichy regime irrevocably cancelled out his achievements as a soldier. To bury him among the dead of Verdun would be to insult the memory of the soldiers who died fighting for the Republic he later dismantled. It would be to equate the savior with the traitor, and to blur a moral line that the nation believes must remain sharp and clear. His place is on his prison island, forever separated from the glory he so desperately craved. You stand once more by the simple white cross on the ILEDYEU. The grave is now covered by a thick slab of concrete to prevent any future escapades. The wind still blows, the sea still whispers. The story that began on a humble farm has ended here, in a fortified grave. A life of incredible highs and abyssal lows, a journey from hero to villain, from savior to traitor. He was a man who embodied the deepest contradictions of his country, its capacity for heroism and its capacity for shame. And even in death, he remains a prisoner, haunted by the battle he won and condemned for the war he lost. The story is over now. The long, strange, and tragic arc of Philippe Pétain has come to its final, quiet end on that windy island. The echoes of his life, the cheers of the victory parade, the whispers in the Vichy hotels, the silence of the courtroom, have all faded away, leaving only the sound of the waves. It is a reminder that history is rarely a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It is often a tangled, messy, human affair, full of people who are complex, contradictory, and sometimes, tragically, both heroes and monsters all at once. And now, as the last images of that island cemetery dissolve, let your mind drift away from the past. Feel the weight of the story begin to lift, replaced by the quiet comfort of your own bed, your own room. The journey is done. The only thing left to do is to let the gentle current of sleep pull you away. Let the rhythm of your own breathing be the soft hum that guides you into your dreams. There are no more trials, no more battles to be fought tonight. Only peace.